Hello everyone, welcome to my channel RPG Retro Reviews, where I, Captain Courageous, take a look back at old school modules and games and try to give them a fun and informative analysis packed with trivia and tips. So this video isn't really a review of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide for Dungeons & Dragons. I've already done that with a two-part look at the DMG, and while it was one of my first reviews and the audio and editing isn't at the same level of my more current reviews, I'm not going to redo it, at least not yet. No, this video really is just my rambling thoughts on this massive tome and why, after 40 years, I still come back to it again and again. My thoughts on the book's mystique and why I think modern gamers could benefit significantly by owning it. I'd like to give a big shout out to Questing Beast, who boldly began his own video series on the 1E Dungeon Master's Guide, where he actually reads it cover to cover. He's got about 3 parts out already, and they are 2 hours long, and his impressions on the book are frequently interesting and amusing, as he's never really read the book before. So this got me sitting down with my own first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. An old and trusted friend, and my mind immediately began a nostalgic trip back to the early 1980s to being 14 years old again, and yes, playing in my parents' basement and weaving tales of dungeon fantasy. There are modules that go with this time frame that we played through on long, carefree, hot summer days: Keep on the Borderlands, Isle of Dread, Dwellers of the Forbidden City, Against the Giants, and many, many more. So won't you come with me then, and let's take a nostalgic look back at the Dungeon Master's Guide for the first edition of the Dungeons & Dragons game. Before we begin, I'd like to give a big shout out to my Patreons for supporting me and invite you to join them as I bring old school RPG reviews to YouTube in a classic style that looks at the content, the trivia, the artwork, where to purchase, as well as some suggestions and tips a DM might find useful when running the modules I discuss. Right now, you can get a hardcover copy of the premium reprint of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide at DriveThruRPG. The print-on-demand copy with the PDF is only $24.50. An affiliate link is in the description. The cover of the Dungeon Master's Guide is so evocative and interesting. At first, there doesn't seem to be much to it, and to be honest, there's certain perspective issues with David Sutherland's rendering here, but it's still so good. There is action, a moment captured, as the inside cover pages describes a group of 3 adventurers confronting an Efreet on the elemental plane of fire. The fabled city of Brass can be seen floating over a flame-swept sea of oil. Wow, that sounds interesting. The image as rendered is so evocative, and then as the imagination goes wild, thinking about how the adventurers got there and what led them to the point shown on the cover. And what and where is the city of Brass mentioned? Oh, it's on the back. That's so cool. The bizarre perspective of Sutherland's rendering here becomes more pronounced when you view the full piece straight on rather than folded as part of a book cover. The geometry is really off as exactly to the placement of the adventurers and the Efreet, which seems to put them in the wall. So what was Sutherland's intention here? The likely explanation is that the perspective is off due to Sutherland's inexperience. That certainly could be the case. The most simple explanation is usually the correct one. But by intention or by accident, this skewed perspective makes the thing seem wrong, and given that it takes place on a strange otherworldly plane, our common expectations of Euclidean geometry may not apply to the elemental plane of fire. So subconsciously, at least to me, this invokes an otherworldly feel, and in the end, making it better than if the perspective was true. What are your thoughts here? What does the cover of the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide evoke in your mind? The foreword to the Dungeon Master's Guide by Mike Carr and the preface by Gary Gygax hold an interesting juxtaposition in my mind. Mike Carr's question, is dungeon mastering a science or an art, immediately elevates the position of the DM by suggesting that it could be either. The reader might just think of themselves as a gamer learning a game, but the foreword suggests that the position of DM makes the gamer reading it something more. Carr further goes on to explain that the task of being a DM is a challenging one, and the book the gamer now holds in their hands will make that task much easier. Gygax's preface is really something. He elevates the DM to the position of final arbiter in the game at the table, but also places himself as the final arbiter of the rules and tells prospective DMs that they should adhere to the rules whenever possible. The players sitting at the table are expecting to play Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, not the DM's homebrew game. This may seem a bit heavy-handed, and Gygax's prose can come off really overly authoritative here, but he's not wrong. Over the years, I've played in many games, especially in the first edition days. There would be DMs with reams of paper dedicated to their own homebrew customizations, and it was rare that I went, "Oh wow, that's really a big improvement." I know back in the early days, I absolutely tried a few of my own homebrew rules, and my successes were few and far between. That led me to my current viewpoint on homebrew rules and added complexity. I simply ask a few questions about them to myself. How does this improve things over what we're already doing? Does this added complexity add time to the task resolution? And if so, is this a good trade-off? In the end, would the net result be the same? If it's the same, why even have this rule? How does this add to and improve the fun of the game? For that reason, things like critical hit charts, special hit rules, rules for armor and weapon degradation, and the like never made it to my table. The next page is the introduction to the AD&D game. There's a discussion on the book's organization and a general overview of the premise of the rules, and it's clear that Gygax is addressing the reader as someone familiar with the game, perhaps someone who has been playing for a while and has now decided to take up the mantle of the DM. There's a discussion on the importance of the DM to know the rules of the game so that they can adjudicate things fairly and so forth. But what I find interesting about this is how Gygax addresses himself. This is written in first person. He says, "I have attempted," or "I have made every effort," and so on. And I find this charming in its own way. It's a very personal introduction to the game and being a dungeon master, and really sets the tone of what is to follow. In the next section, one that I think confounds most modern players of the game, Gygax begins to dedicate 2 full pages to the dice used in the game and dice probability. These are not rules. They are a tutelage on randomization and dice for the novice, or someone who may not be familiar with such things, and it's rather complex stuff. A wide variety of die combinations are discussed, as well as explaining the differences between linear and bell curve probability. The question then is, why did he do this? To old school players, the reason is pretty obvious, but in the realm of modern Dungeons & Dragons, where most situations have been codified by the rules, it's puzzling. It might surprise some modern players that in the core rules of AD&D, the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook, there are no rules for jumping. So if you wanted to jump over a pit, for example, the DM would basically make it up on the spot, and it's little things like that that made each campaign interesting and unique. And it's this freewheeling lack of codification that makes old school play so appealing to many. Take ability scores, for example. A look at a modern character sheet reveals something interesting. Do you see it? The actual ability score is minimized, and it's only the modifier that's given importance because, well, the ability score itself is only there to give you the modifier. After that, it doesn't really matter. Conversely, in old school D&D, some ability scores give the characters nominal enhancements. For example, a 14 strength in modern D&D is pretty good, giving the character a +2 modifier on rolls related to strength. What did you get in AD&D? Nada. Zip. Nothing. That's not to say that having a 14 strength doesn't mean anything. In old school play, ability scores were used to determine many things. Let's go back to a character jumping over a pit, for example. A DM adjudicating a character attempting to jump over a pit might say, roll your strength or less on a d20 to succeed. So now that 14 strength is very important. Note that rolling a d20 creates a linear curve, and most modern gamers are familiar with that. But when I DM'd 1E, I would induce a bell curve by requiring a 3d6 roll to ability checks rather than a d20. This means that without modifiers, characters with a 9 to 12ish range will succeed on average, characters with 13 or better would almost always succeed, and characters with less than 9 would most likely fail. For more easier tasks, I might say roll 2d6 and a d4, and if it was especially hard, roll 2d6 and a d8 or a d10, and I use this instead of negative or positive modifiers to the roll for ability checks in my game. Essentially, it was up to the DM to come up with the probability of success for any given task not inherently covered by the rules if a roll was required, and then decide how to resolve it. Given that context, the need to discuss probability in detail like Gygax does in the DMG becomes a lot more understandable. On page 41 to page 47, suggestions on how one might handle the various spells and their effects is provided. Talk about useful. Here, Gygax takes the time to clarify little idiosyncrasies of various spells, and you can kind of tell he's responding to inquiries of the rules he's received over the years since the publication of original D&D. For example, under Tensor's floating disc, it says, the caster may not ride the disc. The disc always follows the magic user. Or unseen servant. The created force has no shape, so it cannot be clothed. And so on. Good stuff. One of my favorite things to do with the 1E Dungeon Master's Guide is simply to open it to a random page and see what tidbits of knowledge might be uncovered. Sometimes it's something I've read many times over. Other times it's things I read 20 years ago and have forgotten. And other times still, it's something nestled obscurely between other paragraphs that I'm certain I've never read before. Certainly one might be critical of the Dungeon Master's Guide for its bizarre organization, but in many ways it's part of its charm. The sheer volume of useful things far outweighs the mundane. The most useful chapter in the book for modern gamers, I think, begins on page 86, the campaign. Here, Gygax just goes into great detail on the continuing Dungeons & Dragons campaign with article after article of great advice, setting things in motion, climate and ecology, definitions and titles for various forms of government, social structure, economics in a fantasy setting, taxes and fees that might be levied on adventurers, monster populations and placement of monetary treasure, placement of magic items, and so on. And these aren't just one or two paragraphs with generic suggestions. These are full-blown explanations and the reasoning behind such things. Later on, there's a massive explanation of NPC specialists, personalities and traits, random tables to assign each, which can be fun if you're creating many such individuals. Then details on hiring such individuals and the costs involved. Another great article is on page 104, Monsters and Organization. Here, Gygax goes into specific changes in what defenses might occur after a group of adventurers incursions into the lair of a monster or group of monsters and then return days or weeks later. Examples are given for a cave complex, a bandit's camp, a fortress, and more. Magical research is discussed, and Gygax lays out the guidelines for fabrication of magical items, potions, and scrolls, including suggestions on ingredients that might be needed, thereby setting up potential quests for magic user characters who might need such rare and hard-to-find items for their experiments. This takes up a full 3 pages. One of my favorite tables is on page 119, which provides the dangerous and potentially amusing results of mixing magical potions together. What follows next is probably the most interesting and useful part of the book, which is page after page of magic items and artifacts that the DM might introduce into the campaigns. Certainly still useful for ideas a DM might sprinkle into their own campaigns. Page after page, many of the things found here are not reproduced in later editions of the game. Some might find it interesting that in the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons, artifacts were not assigned specific properties, but those were randomly determined or assigned as the DM wished, making each artifact unique to their campaign. The tables and lists begin on page 120 and go on to page 168, so this is probably the single biggest section of the book. Then we get into the famous Appendices, and here's another major section that is still useful to this day, regardless of what edition you're playing. Appendix A, Random Dungeon Generation. I could remember spending several hours with friends just making up random dungeons on graph paper and fighting monsters and seeing what cool treasures we could find with these tables. In the days before computer RPGs, if you didn't have a DM, this was how you did it, back before computer MMOs. I'm pretty sure it's still compatible with whatever version you're running now. Appendix B takes the random dungeon concept to wilderness terrain. Appendix C and D are from random monster encounters. Appendix E is just monster statistics from the monster manual. Appendix F provides some rules for using D&D polyhedral dice to simulate various games of chance from craps, slots, and several other games. Strictly for fun, of course. In my opinion, this should have been Appendix G. Appendix G provides a short percentile table a DM can roll to find a trap at random. Appendix H provides not only a list, but some great examples for inspiration of different types of tricks that might be found within the dank rooms of an abandoned dungeon. These are really good, and some of them rather specific. A secret door that always pivots to the left to reveal a chamber guarded by a basilisk. But if a secret hidden stud is pressed, then it will pivot to the right and allow entry to a chamber containing a magical fountain. There are quite a few interesting entries, and I encourage you to investigate what they are for yourself. Appendix I lists table after table of randomized dungeon dressing, air currents, odors, general knickknacks just lying around on the dungeon floor, unexplained sounds and weird noises, furnishings, and much, much more. Appendix J is amazingly useful, lists and lists of herbs and spices and their potential medicinal uses. Appendix K is a short section to help DMs describe what a magical substance might look like, taste, or even smell like. Appendix L is a group of tables categorized by monster hit dice to aid in the adjudication of conjured animals. Appendix M is essentially the same kind of thing, but greatly expanded to account for the 7 types of monster summoning spells. Then there's the famous Appendix N. Lists of inspirational reading, all of these a winner for those interested in the pulp to weird fantasy genre. Note that there is not a bit of Tolkien anywhere, but there is Poul Anderson, Edgar Rice Burroughs, L. Sprague de Camp, Philip Jose Farmer, Fritz Leiber, H.P. Lovecraft, Jack Vance, and more. Certainly worth investigating and reading all of them. Appendix O lists the encumbrance of standard items. Appendix P provides some guidelines for creating a party on the spur of the moment, especially useful at a convention. Finally, we come to a glossary of terms, very helpful to players new to the game to help familiarize them with the peculiar nomenclature associated with playing Dungeons & Dragons. Lastly is an index that combines the entries from both the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook. Of course, this rambling musing just really scratches the surface of the wisdom and advice that can be found within this classic tome. If you do not own this book and you are a player of fantasy role-playing games, let me suggest you stop whatever it is you are doing right now, go to eBay or DriveThruRPG and get the thing. This is a reference work you will refer to often. Within its pages, you'll find inspiration, humor, knowledge, wisdom, and dare I say, a bit of magic to fuel your imagination for decades. Thank you all so much for going with me on this trip down memory lane. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing it. Of course, I've got more full adventure module reviews coming up, quite a few of them directly from your comments, so please remember to subscribe and click the little bell so you'll get notifications when I upload more content. Give this a like, share, comment below, join the Retro RPG Review Facebook page, and consider supporting the channel by becoming a Patreon. As always, my friends, may your D20 roll true and game on.